IB Bio, Topic 6, Human Physiology, Part 17, Hormones, Homeostasis, Reproduction, D, is the fourth of 4 parts on hormones, homeostasis, and reproduction. This movie will have its focus on female reproductive anatomy and physiology. The essential idea is hormones are used when signals need to be widely distributed through the body. This slide and the next provide an outline of all the movies available in the Human Physiology Topic 6 unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. The focus of this movie can be found on the next slide. This movie is focused here. It's the last movie for Topic 6, Human Physiology. Here are the IB syllabus statements that kick off this movie. Annotate diagrams of the adult male and female reproductive systems to show the names of structures and their functions. State the function of the ovary, oviduct, and uterus in mammalian reproduction. This image nicely shows the position of the paired ovaries, the uterus, and the vagina. In the same way that the male reproductive system has paired testes, the female reproductive system has paired ovaries, one here and one here. The fallopian tube, often called the oviduct, connects the ovary to the uterus. The soft tissue lining the uterus is known as the endometrium. The uterus opens into the vagina through the cervix. Sperm must move from the vagina through the cervix and then into the uterus, and then into the oviduct to reach the egg. One last note, the follicle is the structure that develops and releases an egg into the oviduct once per month. Here's the relevant syllabus statement. Draw and label diagrams of the adult male and female reproductive systems. Can you identify the structures and functions in this diagram? I've color-coded in blue the structures directly related to reproduction. You can stop the movie now or follow along. 1 is the ovary. Meiosis occurs in the ovary, and the ovary releases an egg into the oviduct. 2, this is the oviduct, also known as the fallopian tube. The cilia along the oviduct move the egg toward the uterus. 3 is the uterus. Upon fertilization, the embryo develops within the uterus. 4 is the cervix. Sperm must pass through the cervix to reach the egg that's moving down the oviduct. As well, newborn babies emerge through the cervix. 5, this is the vagina. Sperm are released into the vagina. One last note, it should have struck you that unlike the male reproductive system, there is no common structure for reproduction and urine in females. In fact, unlike males who have 2 openings to the outside, the anus and the urethra, there are 3 openings to the outside in females, the anus, the vagina, and the urethra. Here is an image of one ovary with its adjacent oviduct leading to the uterus. The egg is released into an abdominal space that lies between the ovary and the oviduct. The fimbriae and cilia serve to move the egg into the oviduct toward the uterus. Oogenesis in females involves a complex interplay of hormones to release 1 egg per month on a cycle known as the menstrual cycle. In the course of the month, the anterior pituitary releases FSH and LH, the ovary releases estrogen and progesterone, and in the course of a month, a single egg develops through meiosis, and the egg is released into the oviduct. As well, the uterus readies for implantation of a structure known as a blastocyst that will develop into the embryo. The details of the hormones and the events will be presented in detail throughout this movie. Stay tuned. FSH from the anterior pituitary targets the ovary to initiate the development of a follicle, seen here, within which is the developing egg. A surge of LH from the anterior pituitary results in the release of the egg. The egg is known as a secondary oocyte, more on this later, and this is because it has not yet completed meiosis II. As well, during the 28-day menstrual cycle, the endometrial lining of the uterus, seen here, is developing and thickening, readying for the implantation of this blastocyst, which will develop into the embryo when fertilization occurs, and this is pregnancy. Now in this image, we can see sperm arriving in the oviduct, resulting in fertilization, and this is when meiosis II would be complete. If fertilization does not occur, which is really most often the case in humans, the egg and the endometrial lining are flushed out of the uterus in a process known as menstruation, sometimes called a period. Let me outline oogenesis within the ovary. A cell within the ovary, the diploid oogonium, undergoes mitosis to form two cells, only one of which proceeds into meiosis I. This diploid cell is known as a primary oocyte. The primary oocyte, remember, is diploid, and women are born with approximately 300,000 primary oocytes arrested in prophase I of meiosis. Now, at puberty, the menstrual cycle is initiated, and each month sees the development of one primary oocyte into a haploid secondary oocyte with the formation of a polar body that degenerates. The secondary oocyte is released from the ovary at ovulation, arrested in metaphase II. Unless fertilization occurs, the secondary oocyte never completes meiosis. So let's look at the hormones involved in the female menstrual cycle. Outline the role of hormones in the menstrual cycle, including FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone. The monthly menstrual cycle begins with the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. FSH and LH target the ovary to initiate the development of a primary follicle into a secondary follicle, a primary oocyte into a secondary oocyte. We're talking about meiosis I here. The developing follicle within the ovary releases estrogen and progesterone, which target the uterus to develop the lining of the uterus known as the endometrium. The thickening of the endometrial lining anticipates the implantation of an embryo. Now, the menstrual cycle involves positive and negative feedback. Pay attention to the feedback loops as you progress through the movie. This simplified image shows the anterior pituitary, as well as changes in the ovary over 28 days and changes in the uterus over 28 days. Day 1 of a menstrual cycle begins with the shedding of the endometrial lining. This is the first day of a period that lasts 3 to 5 days. FSH and LH levels rise, targeting the ovary. A follicle within the ovary develops, releasing estrogen that in turn targets the endometrial lining, and the endometrium thickens over time. Estrogen release by the developing follicle targets the anterior pituitary to slow FSH release. This is negative feedback. At day 14, a surge of LH from the anterior pituitary occurs. This causes a rupture of the ovary wall, ovulation around day 14. But now the follicle, empty of the egg, becomes what's called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum continues to secrete estrogen and progesterone. Progesterone and estrogen target the uterus to continue the development of the endometrium. Progesterone and estrogen continue to feed back to the anterior pituitary to inhibit FSH and LH secretion from the anterior pituitary. This again is negative feedback. With no pregnancy, the corpus luteum degenerates. Thus, estrogen and progesterone release declines. The shedding of the endometrial lining begins the next menstrual cycle. The decline of estrogen and progesterone secretion releases the inhibition on FSH and LH secretion, so FSH and LH levels rise, initiating the development of another follicle, the start of another cycle. The menstrual cycle, over 28 days, has layers of activity. Through the first half of the menstrual cycle, the anterior pituitary releases LH and FSH that targets the ovary for follicle development. The follicle develops within the ovary, and the developing follicle releases estrogen and some progesterone that target the endometrial lining of the uterus to ready the uterus for implantation. Now, ovulation happens around day 14. The corpus luteum is what remains of the follicle after ovulation, and the corpus luteum releases progesterone and estrogen to continue the development of the endometrial lining. Notice that progesterone and estrogen secretion by the ovary from the corpus luteum keeps the secretion of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary relatively low. This is negative feedback. If pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum degenerates, and this results in a shedding of the endometrium. This would be day 1 of the next cycle, the next menstrual cycle, with a decline in the amount of progesterone and estrogen being secreted by the corpus luteum. FSH and LH secretion is released from negative feedback inhibition. The rise in the blood levels of these hormones stimulates the development of a new follicle for the next cycle. This diagram is more detailed and good to study. Notice the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. FSH in blue is secreted heavily in the first 14 days of the cycle. The developing follicle releases estrogen, the endometrial lining develops, the LH surge results in ovulation, the corpus luteum secretes both estrogen and progesterone to continue endometrial development. Without fertilization, the corpus luteum degenerates, starting a new cycle with the shedding of the endometrial lining. Here is a diagram of the ovary showing primary follicles here, within which are primary oocytes that are diploid. The primary follicle is ready to develop into the secondary follicle under the influence of FSH from the anterior pituitary. Now let me clarify some terms and provide a bit of background. The follicle is a multicellular structure composed of an egg cell with many other cells, some of which are closely associated with the egg, providing nutritive support. But some of the cells of the follicle are endocrine in function, releasing estrogen early in the 28-day menstrual cycle and progesterone in the second half of the cycle. The estrogen targets the lining of the uterus to stimulate the development of the endometrium in case of fertilization. So the primary follicle develops under the influence of FSH into the secondary follicle. Meiosis I has occurred. The mature follicle ruptures, releasing the secondary oocyte, its haploid, into the oviduct, approximately on day 14 of the menstrual cycle. This is known as ovulation. The secondary oocyte has not yet completed meiosis II. The part of the follicle that remains behind within the ovary becomes what's known as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum continues to secrete progesterone and estrogen in the second half of the menstrual cycle. These hormones target the endometrium of the uterus to ready the lining for implantation of an embryo in case of fertilization. Here's another image of the ovary and the developing follicle. FSH initiates the development of the primary follicle to the secondary follicle. The developing follicle secretes estrogen. Ovulation of the secondary oocyte can be seen here. Remember that the secondary oocyte has completed meiosis I, but not meiosis II, and the corpus luteum that remains within the ovary is an endocrine structure. The corpus luteum continues to secrete progesterone and estrogen in the second half of the menstrual cycle. These hormones target the endometrium of the uterus to ready the lining for implantation of an embryo in case of fertilization. Here is a micrograph of ovulation. The rupture of the ovary wall releases a secondary oocyte deep within a large cluster of attendant cells known collectively as the corona radiata. So that brings us to this statement. You need to be able to annotate a graph showing hormone levels in the menstrual cycle, illustrating the relationship between changes in hormone levels and ovulation menstruation, and thickening of the endometrium. This graph shows the changing levels of hormones through the 28-day menstrual cycle, and the graph is paralleled by the ovarian cycle here and the uterine cycle here. I will focus on the graph, and as I talk through the graph, you must relate the changes in hormone levels to the ovarian and uterine cycles. At the start of a new menstrual cycle, FSH and LH levels rise as progesterone and estrogen levels decline at the end of the previous cycle. The inhibition by progesterone and estrogen on FSH and LH has been released. FSH targets the ovary, and the developing follicle secretes estrogen. Estrogen levels rise, and in turn, estrogen inhibits FSH and LH, both of which decline slightly. But estrogen also targets the follicle, resulting in continued growth of the follicle. An ever larger follicle secretes more and more estrogen. This is positive feedback, and there's more detail around positive feedback. I'll just cover this in class. Estrogen levels reach high levels, and for reasons poorly understood, this stimulates the anterior pituitary to release a surge of LH and FSH, and this results in ovulation. Then the corpus luteum secretes progesterone until, without fertilization, the corpus luteum degenerates, progesterone and estrogen levels decline, ending the menstrual cycle. Once again, here's a nice diagram that relates the changing hormone levels to changes in the ovary and changes in the uterus. FSH and LH levels rise early in the 28-day cycle. These pituitary hormones stimulate follicle development in the ovary, and the follicle secretes estrogen, which you can see rising here. Estrogen inhibits FSH and LH. You can see the decline in their levels here. This is negative feedback. But estrogen also targets the follicle itself. The follicle develops more, and more estrogen is secreted. Positive feedback. But the high levels of estrogen, seen right here, cause a surge in LH around day 14, ovulation. The corpus luteum within the ovary secretes progesterone and estrogen. You can see those levels are high in the last 14 days of the cycle. Estrogen and progesterone target the uterus for the development of the endometrial lining. Without fertilization, the corpus luteum degenerates, progesterone and estrogen levels decline, ending the cycle. The endometrial lining is shed. This is day 1 of the next cycle. Here's a graph that strictly shows the hormones without the accompanying ovarian or uterine cycles. FSH and LH rise early in the cycle due to low levels of estrogen and progesterone that would otherwise inhibit their secretion. The rising levels of estrogen seen here inhibit FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary, and we can see this as FSH declines as the estrogen rises. This is negative feedback. Estrogen levels continue to rise with the development of the follicle, such that high levels of estrogen stimulate the anterior pituitary to release LH. This is the surge in LH. The feedback mechanism is poorly understood. The LH surge results in ovulation, and with ovulation, the corpus luteum remains in the ovary to secrete both progesterone and estrogen. These levels are high in the late parts of the cycle. When the corpus luteum degenerates, progesterone and estrogen levels decline, ending the cycle. This slide isolates the hormone cycles of the ovary and the hormone cycles of the anterior pituitary related to the menstrual cycle, and it follows the changes occurring in the ovary and in the uterus. Study this slide to understand the roles of the hormones and the relationships among the hormones and the ovary and the uterus. I've come back to this relatively complicated slide for you to study. Relate the details of this slide with the graphs shown in the previous 2 slides. Again, here are the components of the menstrual cycle isolated. Study this slide to be able to outline the role of hormones in the menstrual cycle, including FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone. And study this slide to be able to annotate a graph showing hormone levels in the menstrual cycle, illustrating the relationship between changes in hormone levels and ovulation, menstruation, and thickening of the endometrium. So these are the IB syllabus statements that I've been following. outline the role of hormones in the menstrual cycle, including FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone, annotate a graph showing hormone levels in the menstrual cycle, illustrating the relationship between changes in hormone levels and ovulation, menstruation, and thickening of the endometrium. I'm hoping that you're gaining strength with these two statements. Could you identify the hormones numbered here? I would start with the moment of ovulation, day 14, the LH surge. Hormone 3 is LH. The hormone that stimulates follicle development during the first 14 days is FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Hormone 1 is FSH. The principal hormone produced by the corpus luteum following ovulation is progesterone, hormone 4. With 3 of the 4 hormones identified, use deductive reasoning to get the last one. Hormone 2 is estrogen. Estrogen has the most complicated role because it serves to stimulate the development of the endometrium of the uterus, and it targets the follicle itself to cause follicle development through the first 14 days until ovulation. Progesterone targets the uterus to cause endometrial development. Can you state that estrogen and progesterone cause the prenatal development of female reproductive organs and development of secondary sex characteristics during puberty? In fact, estrogen has 3 roles, 2 of which I've already mentioned, but the development of secondary sex characteristics must be added. The secondary sex characteristics are breast development, widening of the pelvis, and axillary hair growth. Spend some time studying this slide. I've returned to this slide to strengthen one aspect of the positive feedback tied to estrogen. In days 12 to 14, high levels of estrogen cause an LH surge rather than an inhibition of LH or FSH. The mechanism of the LH surge in response to high levels of estrogen is poorly understood. The negative feedback exerted by progesterone and estrogen on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary occur throughout most of the menstrual cycle. Progesterone and estrogen tend to inhibit negative feedback, inhibit FSH and LH. It is on this basis that birth control pills serve to prevent pregnancy. Birth control pills composed of estrogen and progesterone inhibit FSH, without which there is no follicle development, no egg to be ovulated, no possibility of pregnancy. Here is a summary of the hormones of the menstrual cycle and their roles. Spend some time studying this slide. Let's shift our focus to outlining the process of in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization is fertilization that takes place in a test tube or culture dish outside the woman's body, and the embryos are reimplanted into the woman's uterus. The IB statement continues, the use in IVF of drugs to suspend the normal secretion of hormones, followed by the use of artificial doses of hormones to induce superovulation, many eggs, and establish a pregnancy. Drugs are used to suspend the woman's normal cycle. Hormones are used to induce the woman's ovaries to grow several mature eggs rather than the single egg that normally develops each month. Doctors monitor the development of ovarian follicles using ultrasound and blood samples to measure the blood levels of estrogen and LH. By interpreting the results of ultrasound and blood tests, the IVF specialist determines the best time to harvest or remove the eggs. The mature eggs are harvested and mixed with male sperm provided by the woman's partner. Following fertilization, the embryos are allowed to develop to the 8-cell stage, whereupon a number of embryos are implanted into the woman's uterus. Drugs are used to suspend the woman's normal menstrual cycle. Hormones are used to induce the woman's ovaries to grow several mature eggs. The mature eggs are harvested and mixed with the male sperm provided by the woman's partner. Following fertilization, the embryos are allowed to develop to the 8-cell stage, whereupon a number of embryos are implanted into the woman's uterus for a pregnancy. You can see embryos being selected for implantation into the uterus. Chances for pregnancy are better if many embryos are transferred into the uterus in a treatment cycle. Stop the movie now and study this slide to review the IVF process. Hopefully, you can outline the process of in vitro fertilization, and that brings us to discussing the ethical issues associated with IVF. Here are the various arguments for and against IVF. Remember, you need to be able to discuss the ethical issues associated with IVF. IVF is expensive. Thus, is it available to everyone? Should tax dollars support its use? Many embryos are implanted. Some might die. Some remain frozen in the lab. Is it acceptable that some embryos die? What should be done with the frozen embryos? Is it acceptable that IVF is often unsuccessful? Is it acceptable for families to suffer the anguish of unsuccessful attempts? Embryologists select the embryos for transfer. Is it acceptable that a human being is selecting the embryos to live? Is the unnatural act of IVF acceptable? You can see certain ethical issues raised in this IVF flyer produced by KidSpot. You can turn the movie off to study this slide, but let me highlight a few items. IVF isn't for everyone. Could you elaborate on this? There are affordable options. Can you discuss the issues around affordability? Who bears the cost? Should insurance pay for IVF? Success rates are much higher than they were 20 years ago. What's underneath this statement? Some embryos die. Freezing fertilized eggs is much easier. Notice the statement doesn't use the term embryo, instead using the phrase fertilized egg. What happens to embryos that are not used? Who determines the fate of frozen embryos? Some couples have whole families from one IVF cycle. What about the families for whom IVF does not work? Does IVF set up false hopes? Do people suffer when IVF does not work? And that brings us to the end of IB Bio Topic 6, Human Physiology, Part 17, Hormones, Homeostasis, Reproduction, D, the end of Topic 6.